Hello everybody, welcome to this talk about community approaches in social work, thinking about the country of Germany. And look at this for a long Germanic title: Social Pedagogy, Social Space and Social Work Theory, shaping Germany's community approaches to social work. I'm guessing you're watching this because you're going to come to Germany and think about Germany's social work tradition. And it's lovely to have this comparative social work topic. How is community different in German social work compared to elsewhere? I guess for first of all, I have to say something a little bit boring. I must warn you in advance, some of Germany's community work traditions really are the same as in the US or the UK or other parts of Northern Europe. And in particular, I would focus on the 1940s to the 1960s. This was a time when German social work wasn't so homegrown, and there were certainly lots of commonalities with in the neighbouring countries in that period. So we can look at this from a Northern European perspective as the time of welfarism. You know, the welfare state was growing solidly. And in terms of our community approaches, we had a focus on things like housing. We were still in the middle of a rebuilding project, a focus on things like local services. So in a sense, that period's community work in Germany is not so interesting. What is interesting are the community approaches over the last few decades. So go back to my question, this fun comparative social work question. Why? You know, why is community work, why is community different in German social work? Where do those differences come from? And this is a common question I ask my students. You know, why can social work be different in different places? And it's lovely to make a list. You can often come up with 10 or 12 reasons why social work has a different form in a different country. We won't have time to talk about everything today, but certainly if you ask me to pin down why this German homegrown approach to community and social work is different, I think it reflects different social movements, different grassroots movements. That's important for community. Maybe it reflects different ideas of community, the relationship between the individual and the community and the state maybe. Maybe it reflects different ideas of what social work is. German soziale Arbeit is not the same as social work in England or America. You know, these words have a different meaning and a little bit gets lost in translation. Finally, and a point I'm really highlighting today, you've got quite different social work theory discourses in Germany, and that changes how we see community. So there's a whole lot I could talk about, but to really recap the procedure for this session, I'm going to focus on 3 specific reasons for differences, and it really is those reasons in my title. The influence of social pedagogy is going to be my first topic, the idea of social space, my next one, and then the idea of theory, which is specific to Germany. And I'm going to give you an example right at the end of my presentation. Jump in to that first question, social pedagogy. I think social pedagogy has made a real difference to how we think about community in German social work. This is my thesis. I didn't get taught this when I was a student in Germany. My own professors didn't highlight this point, but I think it really is an incredibly important factor. So what can I say about social pedagogy? The basics, first of all, the term is old. It was created in 1844, so this is going back almost 200 years. And certainly the first decades were not a time when it was in current usage. It didn't develop much in the course of its first 50 years or so, but then it very quickly did. It really boomed in the early 20th century. And for the duration of the 20th century, you can generalize and say social pedagogy and not social work was the dominant social profession. So social pedagogy, as the word suggests in its etymology, you know, this is about pedagogy. This is theorizing about learning, about education, about child raising. And the early theorists were actually philosophers, educator philosophers. So very, very rich intellectual heritage. Now, there is an interesting coincidence in terms of timing. The early social pedagogy theorising happened parallel to some important early legislation. And in particular, I'm going to focus on legislation at the start of the 20th century. We had the Reichsgesetz für Jugendwohlfahrt, which was passed in 1922. And in a sense, that the growth of social pedagogy and the institutionalization of these services happened parallel. Let's talk about the theory first. I should give you a context though. Germany in the 1920s, going back 100 years, the big cities were very much shaped by mass poverty. It was almost like Dickensian London a few decades earlier. We did, however, have a young democracy. Women had the vote and were able to stand for parliament, so that law was passed in part by female MPs. We had a growing state, and maybe an early nascent idea of welfarism was already there, and also a vibrant charity sector. So kind of interesting contextual background for this law and for this theory. But now comes the theory, and it's lovely for me to give you a quote. I'm going to go back a few decades. This is earlier than the time I've just been talking about. This is Paul Natorp, and he said something really quite wonderful. Let's look at this quote together. The human being becomes a human being only due to human community. The individual human being is actually only an abstraction, like the atom of the physicist. Isn't that a fascinating idea? For me, of course, it was quite striking. I grew up in Britain in the 1980s. In my childhood, we had Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister. She famously said there is no such thing as society. She claimed you could only see us as being a collection of individuals and families. So he's saying provocatively, this is the exact opposite idea. There is no such thing as the individual. We are a human being because of our membership of a community. Well, what a radical idea. And when he was defining social pedagogy, he noted the subject of our science is therefore the social conditions of education and the educational conditions of social life. And we view this not as two tasks separable from one another, but rather as a single whole. So this is a view of this new science, this new discipline, social pedagogy. As I said, it dominated over social work in 20th century Germany, and it has a very interesting view of the human being at its conceptual theoretical core. So that's a lovely starting point for guessing what social work can mean in this German social pedagogic sense. Back to the legislation, so we had these services 20 years after that quote was 1899. We had these services in the 1920s, and basically what we had was a community child welfare and family support system, a kind of network of organisations providing local services integrated into one whole system via this law, via this legislation. The first anchor of this system was this idea of low threshold local welfare help. For example, family counselling was already established in Germany at that time. But the second anchor, fascinatingly, was actually community activities, things like youth work, things like the kindergarten system, early education, community recreation, free time activities, that was integrated into this one very broad welfare system. So it's a child welfare system which includes everything that's in some sense social pedagogic. So an amazingly broad and quite holistic idea of the child in the child's community setting. So there you are, social pedagogy in theory, but also institutionalized, very much pushing the social professions in a community direction. Let me move on now, though. I want to move on and talk about the next influence which I want to highlight, the next influence which has shaped how Germans see community in their social work. I want to talk about critical social work and critical theory. I don't have the time to actually define critical social work and define critical theory. I could, and it's something that you can research. It's a wonderfully fun topic. And one of my references is from the Journal of Radical and Critical Social Work. So I encourage you to pursue that on your own. But to summarize, when we think about critical theory, we tend to start by thinking about the work of the Frankfurt School. And this was a particular group of philosophers, social philosophers, active from the 1930s onwards. And a key starting point would be Horkheimer's paper, Traditional and Critical Theory. And he was really pushing philosophy forwards with this. He was really proposing a critical theory to replace the positivist traditional theory that was current at the time. So it's very much against positivism. That's another word, if you're a student, you can look up, against positivism, and very much for a critical approach to thinking about society. And there's a real bridge to that Marxist idea, the Feuerbach thesis here. Philosophy should question, should bring about societal change. That's the role of philosophy. That's what philosophy is there for. And we social professionals in Germany took that idea for our social pedagogy. Mollenhauer famously in the 60s wrote a book about emancipation. The word was in the title, emancipation. So that social work idea of liberation found an early predecessor there in the 60s. And my illustration here is also from the 1960s. You're seeing a big demonstration. This was a time when people got onto the streets, they protested. Since the 1960s, I think it's really valid to say that most social pedagogy theory has primarily drawn from critical theory. You know, it has an enormous role in shaping social pedagogy theory in Germany ever since. So these thinkers, for example, in Mollenhauer's period, it was all about services supporting citizens, using democratic structures, you know, democracy, participation. These were the main ideas of the time. Often practitioners were a bit critical of state institutions, and instead they were interested in looking at civil society movements. So we had service user self-help movements, so user movements, self-help, citizens initiatives, citizens action groups, citizens rights groups. You know, these were the people which social workers were interested in supporting. And there's obvious parallels to the early UK radical social work of the 1970s. We can't talk about the differences here. It's interesting for another day. But if I was to summarise the difference, I think that the German movement was a bit more prolonged. The British radical social work is having a beautiful renaissance right now. It's been quite current for the last 10 or 15 years or so. But if you go back, it had difficult days, you know, in the 1980s. And I think in Germany, that critical momentum was a bit more constant. And I'll come back to some of these critical ideas shortly. Before I return to these critical theory ideas, though, I need to introduce this other term which I've promised to talk about today, the idea of social space. Germans love conceptualizing community approaches around the idea of social space, and they talk about a social space orientation, or if you want to make it complicated, a social spatial orientation. Hard to say, another tongue twister. Now, this is a really good example of a discourse. As far as I know, this is specific to German language social work. It's tricky to translate into English. It's from approximately 1990 onwards, late 1980s, and it kind of boomed in the 90s, the early 2000s. It really became a dominant way of thinking about social work. It took its inspiration from other disciplines, in this case, particularly urban geography, particularly philosophy, taking the idea of the social surroundings, the social environment as a starting point. And if you want to get a feeling for how it is in terms of its principles, maybe a nice starting point would be Lefebvre's right to the city. This idea of the right to the city, inclusive, accessible, democratic spaces. Inclusive spaces, accessible spaces, democratic spaces. That's a lovely starting point. That's really the spirit of this theory. A big German phrase at the time, in the early 2000s, was vom Fall zum Feld. Fall is like case, Feld, as you can guess, is like field. So this is about replacing individual casework approaches with field community approaches. So going away from the casework with the original and instead looking at the community as the starting point for our practice. It's tied to particular methods, so there's methods that are tied to it. It's tied to particular theories. It's very compatible with many German theories. I'll give you an example in a minute. And it's certainly tied to particular attitudes, particular values. In German we say Haltung. It's really attached to certain Haltungen. One author who's wrote a lovely paper in English, which I can thoroughly recommend, Spacek, he argues it's a paradigm. He says, this is so dominant in German practice today. This is really a way of thinking about social work. And because it has that dominant status, we can describe it as a paradigm. So Kuhn's term there to describe a stable model after a scientific revolution. So there you are. That's how we think about social work today with the social space orientation. The same paper from Spacek also highlights some of the common threads in thinking about social space. He notes different German social work thinkers see it a little bit differently, and he identifies different core groups, but he says there are commonalities in how we think and how we see this social work with a social space orientation. He says, firstly, it's driven by citizens' wishes, it's driven by citizens' interests, so it's coming very organically out of the community there. Help to self-help. This is a real key German idea. This is almost how we think about social work. It's help to self-help. There's ties with service user-led organizations. So it really is about supporting self-help in the community. It's a strengths-based approach, not at the individual level, but at the community level. So in German, we talk about a resource orientation. It's about breaking up traditional institutional or bureaucratic responsibilities. This point is really important in Germany, where we are a bit bureaucratic in the German-speaking countries. We do like our bureaucracy. So it's about breaking up some of those traditional bureaucratic ways of thinking. That's not my responsibility. You're not allowed to say that if you're really an advocate of this social space orientation. It's about integrating services, coordinating, it's about networking, and very much about joined up services. So again, you'll notice some parallels with some of those ideas in the UK around, say, the short start concept, that early intervention idea, local joined up services, a net of care with no holes in it. Finally, it's about support for personal growth, support for personal development. Another lovely educational term in the German language is Bildung. And you could say this is all about Bildung. Again, kind of going back to the idea of supporting the human being to become a person with agency, to become a social actor, somebody that can shape their world, a subject in society. So a whole bunch of lovely ideas related to this term. And this takes us to my last topic, the theories that we have in German social work, which are interesting thinking about community. And there's really a bridge from my last slide to this one, because this figure who I'm going to talk about now really is a theorist that uses that social spatial approach. In fact, he was an early author to actually use that phrase. I want to give you some examples of social work theories in Germany. And I guess the first question is, aren't German social work theories the same as everybody else's? Don't we have common social work theories? It looks like that in the English-speaking world, but when you go to Germany, you'll notice something quite wonderful. We have such a diversity of social work theories. There's so many, they're so interesting, many of them are so beautiful. So this is a development from the 1960s onwards, and it's picking up on that earlier social pedagogic tradition I started my talk with. Germans use theories from their own country. My students in Germany, they'll be getting books out of the library, and those books out of the library are German language texts citing German language authors. So you've got a German theory scene, and it's totally self-contained. It's almost like a bubble. It's quite fascinating. These theories often integrate contemporary ideas from philosophy, from sociology. Unsurprisingly, German language ideas are particularly dominant. So there's a big idea from a German thinker, that will really quickly be spread across the German social work theory scene. And I'm going to give you such an example here. Traditionally, critical theories had a huge influence, as I said, from the 60s onwards, as are Germany's own social pedagogic traditions, who often get a bridge to the 1920s or even earlier. I want to give you one specific example. I want to talk about maybe the dominant German social work theory today from this gentleman here. This is Hans Tisch, and I want to talk about his life world orientation for social work. This goes back to the 1970s, and in the 70s he actually had a slightly different concept but related. He talked about an everyday orientation. He said that social pedagogy should have an everyday orientation. But in the 1980s, social work became influenced by a very, very interesting text. I've got the English version here. This is Habermas's book on communicative action. So the theory of communicative action. And Habermas talked about the life world, and this word became very current in German discourses. So I want to talk briefly about Habermas and the life world. Well, it's a concept from philosophy, from German language philosophy, from phenomenology. Another tongue twister for today. So a term from phenomenology. My life world, my beliefs about myself, the world around me as I perceive it, as I interact in it. And Habermas was a Frankfurt School thinker, the younger generation, a second generation thinker. He's still alive today, so our leading public intellectual in Germany, still publishes, still appears with interesting pieces in the paper. So yeah, a hero of our intellectual scene. And he had a particularly rich number of ideas in the 1980s, which is when this comes from. But the life world for Habermas is, get this for a quote, a culturally transmitted and linguistically organized stock of interpretive patterns. So it's how we're thinking about the world and communicating about the world. Our life world is everywhere in our informal community lives. Maybe my neighbour's having some difficulties, mobility problems, getting out of a house. I nip out to do some shopping for her. Maybe another neighbour says hello and we agree to meet up for a beer. These are life world interactions. And our life world interactions are transparent, communicative action. We can enter into discourse with other people. We can argue about stuff. We can find consensus. This is how our life world interactions work. Transparent, communicative action. Habermas contrasts the life world with what he calls the system. And that communication is different. So in the system, we have what he calls instrumental action. Okay, so the system, when I say the system, I'm thinking about state bureaucracies. So think about laws, think about state bureaucracies, administration, state institutions. A social services department would be an example of an organization which does this instrumental action. In part, it has to because of its roots in social legislation. Habermas sees this as potentially a problem. If there's too much of this system and too little freedom for the life world, the state, the system can smother the life world. So there's a real danger of colonization of the life world by the system. Okay, so the system encroaches upon the life world, it throttles it, takes away its oxygen, eventually making it unwell. It's an amazingly powerful idea. German authors used Habermas's ideas in different ways. Some just picked that as a metaphor, so that was used metaphorically and they were applying that to social work. Some were using Habermas's conceptual framework, all of his terms and concepts, to build social work theories. So a remarkably successful inspiration for theory production in German social pedagogy. If you're interested, there's also interesting English language literature with very similar applications. So by the time everybody was using this world, Tisch started using it himself, and he talked about his own theory as a life world orientation. And it has, once again, community at its core. And maybe I can make this clear by citing from a paper. Once again, there's some English language literature which I can recommend for you. You'll find this and all the other references at the end. He cites 5 maxims for life world oriented social work. He talks about prevention. He says it's about establishing and consolidating a robust infrastructure of supportive services and cultivating general life coping skills. It's about an everyday orientation or an everyday relevance, placing accessible, low threshold and holistic social care in the service user's life world. He says it's about decentralization, it's about regionalization, localism, you might say. And another quote from Tiersch and Grunwald, that every day, the actual living space as it's experienced, this social environment, and not the specialization of the services itself, is the basis for the planning. Fourth point, fourth maxim, integration. So they write about social cohesion, they write about social inclusion. And finally, we have this idea of participation, involvement, co-determination, collaborative planning. Yeah, it's that democratic stuff again, isn't it? This idea of the citizens' orientation, but also that it comes from the citizens. So a brutally short summary of part of Tiersch's theory there. I invite you to investigate it in much more detail. It deserves more than I've given it here. But this theory example brings me back to my opening point, to my talk's title, which is also my conclusion here. If you'd asked me what's special about community in German social work discourses, it's because of the influence of theory, the influence of this spatial paradigm. German social work, it's not so much practice with community as one of its methods. It's not really about that as, say, Anglo-Saxon social work might be. Rather, it's a social work which has the principles of a community really at its heart. So a community in Germany is not really an add-on thing, but rather it's the center, it's the soul of our social work and social pedagogy. That's my closing thought for you. Have fun with some of this literature, and thanks very much for reviewing. Bye.